beste luisteraars. We wensen je veel groetjes uit Shambhala. Ik ben Jonas Laats en zit deze keer opnieuw samen met...
Paul van der Velde.
Samen reizen we af en toe door de wereld van de hedendaagse spiritualiteit en esoterie. In onze podcasts wisselen we telkens weer van gedachten over wat we op die reizen te zien krijgen. En deze keer werden we op onze reis vergezeld door een Amerikaanse professor.
My name is William Cavanaugh. I am a professor at DePaul University in Chicago. I'm in a department of Catholic Studies, and I'm the director of the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, a research center about the Church in the Global South.
Enkele jaren geleden las ik voor het eerst professor William Cavanaugh's boek The Myth of Religious Violence. Dat boek schudde mijn kijk op religie en secularisme grondig dooreen. Religie wordt over het algemeen gezien als iets inherent gewelddadigs omdat het op irrationele geloofsovertuigingen gebaseerd is, terwijl secularisme wordt voorgesteld als een meer rationele manier om meningsverschillen te organiseren. Maar Cavanaugh draaide dergelijke alledaagse veronderstellingen volledig op hun kop. En dat deed hij met heel wat solide feiten en grondige argumenten. In mijn eigen artikels en boeken citeer ik Cavanaugh dan ook geregeld. Ik ben nu eenmaal een grote fan. Het mag dan ook voor zich spreken dat ik bijzonder blij was toen ik hoorde dat professor Cavanaugh in november een tournee zou doen in Nederland. Hij werd immers uitgenodigd door De Zinnen, een katholiek netwerk voor inspiratie en dialoog. En zij vroegen hem om aan meerdere universiteiten een lezing te geven over zijn boek. Zijn laatste stop was de Radboud Universiteit en dat vormde uiteraard een prachtige gelegenheid om hem ook even uit te nodigen in onze Shambhala-studio, die op gewone dagen nu eenmaal dienst doet als Pauls bureau. Paul, William en ikzelf hadden er een diepgaand gesprek over verschillende blinde vlekken in het dagelijkse discours rond religie, secularisme, spiritualiteit en geweld. Logischerwijze spraken we natuurlijk wel in het Engels. Deze aflevering is dan ook een beetje een uitzondering. Voor één keertje is die niet in het Nederlands. Wie het wat moeilijker vindt om in het Engels te luisteren, kan een Nederlandstalig interview lezen op de website van Volzin. Dat interview vormt een bewerkte samenvatting van enkele fragmenten uit ons gesprek. Maar hopelijk vormt het Engels geen probleem, want wat mij betreft is het gehele gesprek meer dan de moeite waard. Ik maak trouwens wel meer podcasts in het Engels, dus misschien is dit wel een goed moment om dat even mee te geven aan het luisterpubliek van Groetjes uit Shambhala. Mijn Engelstalige podcasts publiceer ik onder de titel Revisioning Religion. En in die podcasts heb ik eveneens diepgaande dialogen, maar dan eerder op het kruispunt van religie, mystiek en politiek. En dat met experten uit de hele wereld. Eerdere gasten waren bijvoorbeeld Bernardo Kastrup en Jeffrey Kripal. Zo dus, mocht dat jouw interesse wekken, zoek dan zeker eens naar Revisioning Religion in je favoriete podcast-app. Maar nu dus eerst een gesprek met William Cavanaugh over de mythe van religieus geweld. Bill, the moment we're recording now, you're actually doing a tour in Holland, in the Netherlands, to talk about your book, The Myth of Religious Violence. But it's not just been published. It's a couple of years old. When did it come out?
2009, actually.
2009.
This is the third time I've been to the Netherlands to talk about this book.
Okay, so it's a very popular book. I must say I'm still a huge fan of the book. I've always been. And so something of the contents triggers a lot of people. It's about the myth of religious violence. That's also the topic we're going to discuss today. But so before we really delve into some intricacies and nuances and so on, we first have to outline the main points of the book. And I thought, let's make my starting question a bit more focused. You've got a lot of people when you're on a reception or, I don't know, a family gathering or so on, and then you say you're a professor of theology, I guess. Lots of people come to you and they say, oh, religion, who still deals with religion? Religion, that's what created all of the violence in the world. If we would get rid of religion, then there would be a lot less violence. What do you say to somebody who brings that argument to the table?
Oh, I have to go and take a phone call. That's what I usually say to them. No. Yeah, having a book called The Myth of Religious Violence is kind of like having a book called The Myth of the Spherical Earth or something like that. People just look at you like you're a flat earther or somebody who's just not in touch with reality. So maybe it might help to start by saying what the argument is not, right? The argument is not that the causes of violence are not really religious, they're really political or economic. I don't think you can make those kinds of arguments stick. You just listen to what ISIS has to say about the reasons for doing things. And also, I'm arguing in the book that these separations between religion and politics and economics are somewhat artificial. And so carving the world up that way, I don't think works. And nor does it work to say, the Crusaders aren't really Christians, or, ISIS is not really Muslims. Normatively, I think it's important for Christians and Muslims to say, yeah, the Crusaders got it wrong, ISIS has got it wrong. But descriptively, empirically, you can't just excuse your own tribe by saying, they don't really belong to us. And anybody who does bad things is not really a Christian. I mean, that doesn't work. That's disingenuous. So the argument is not that, and I won't put it in the negative, I'll put it in the positive. I fully accept that people can and do violence inspired by Christianity, Islam, etc. But the myth of religious violence is the idea that there's something called religion which is inherently more prone to violence than secular ideologies and institutions. And so the whole thing depends on this religious-secular distinction, that there's this thing called religion, and it's, there from, all times, all places, and it's inherently more violent than non-religious, secular sorts of things. And I just think that that's not true. And so you can look at the last 100 years and ask who's done more violence, atheists or Muslims? And the answer is atheists, and it's not even close. Under Marxist regimes, you've got anywhere between 70 and 110 million people killed. You look at World War I, 38 million casualties, nationalism is the cause, those sorts of arguments. But I don't want to just assume that we all know what we're talking about when we say there's religion and then there's secular. People have in mind that religion means Christianity, Buddhism, Confucianism, Islam, and so on. And then secular things are Marxism, nationalism, atheism, capitalism, and so on. But what you find when you look at the literature about religion and violence is how unstable these categories are. So Christopher Hitchens, for example, famous atheist, when he looks at this evidence that Marxism causes violence, right? He deals with this problem by just moving Marxism over to the other side of the table so that it now counts as religion. So anything violent is classified as religious,
it's
right?
religious-like, so that's good enough.
Right.
It's a type of religion, even though it's Marxism, something like that. Yeah.
And then everything he likes ends up in the secular category. So he says that Martin Luther King was not really a Christian because he was nonviolent, and Christianity is violent by definition because it's religious. So there's all sorts of that kind of smoke and mirrors going on in these categories. So first in the book, I point out that this is happening and then ask why and do a history of this religious-secular distinction and find that it's a modern Western distinction and it's used for certain ideological purposes. First in the West, to kind of marginalize the church in these early modern conflicts between the church and the state. And then it gets exported to the rest of the world in the process of colonization. And then suddenly you have religions popping up all over the place. And there's something called Hinduism that becomes a religion. And it has certain ideological uses for the colonizers. And so the last part of the book then is looking at some of these ideological uses for this myth.
Perhaps we should go a bit deeper into that, because I think we'll need it in the rest of our conversation as well. If you say it specifically originated in the West, it has a political reason why the myth became so strong and why it still is that strong, because as you pointed out, the last century, the 20th century, which is about the only one where we can make a comparison between so-called secular ideologies and religious ideologies and which ones did the most violence or killed the most people. And then indeed it's more about communism and World War, which is nationalism, and it's the Cold War, a big one as well, Cambodia, Vietnam and so on. So if you just look at the facts, it's so obvious that the myth of religious violence is problematic. We all know this from history books, and still the myth perpetuates. So why is that? Why is it so strong? What is its political basis?
So in domestic policy, it's a way of reinforcing secular arrangements, right? So that you exclude Christians, Muslims, and so on from certain kinds of presence in the public sphere, from education and politics and other kinds of arrangements, because you say, oh no, that's dangerous. So the U.S. Supreme Court, until about 1940, invoked religion as a unifying element in American society, and from 1940 on, they invoke it as a divisive element in American society. So you need to ban school prayer. The state can't subsidize Catholic schools, and on and on and on, because if you did, it would cause violence. So there's a domestic use, and then the foreign policy use is primarily directed against Muslims these days. We are secular and therefore peaceful. Our violence is rational. They mix religion and politics, and so they are inherently dangerous. And so we need to bomb them into the higher rationality.
Yeah. We bomb them into democracy while they are fanatical religious people. We even had somebody in Belgium, which is a frequently asked speaker on national television, and he once succeeded in saying that the violence of ISIS is inherently way more bad than the Holocaust because ISIS was religious and the Holocaust hadn't been. He comes from the more atheist, skeptical parts of society and that kind of academia. But yeah, that kind of idea is around sometimes.
Wow.
So that's the present ideological, political reasons why the myth of religious violence could be useful. But the last part I think we need, and which your book delves into in great length, is the fact that it also props up, let's say, the worldview itself, why secularism is good. And I'm trying to get at the migrations of the holy, which I think is a brilliant term to describe it. So maybe just that one a little bit further. How would you explain those migrations of the holy, and why are they so important?
Yeah, migration of the holy is a term that I borrow from the historian John Bossy, who talks about the way the holy migrates from the church to the state in the period. He's looking at the period of 1400 to 1700. And you can see that in many different ways, how the divine right of kings is not a medieval idea. It's an early modern idea where you now have Louis XIV, the Sun King, and so on, and all of these kinds of borrowing Christian symbols to deify the monarchy and the state, and so on. And then a little bit later, nationalism becomes, a lot of scholars of nationalism sort of argue that it becomes what replaces Christendom, Christianity, in the West. And so now dealing with death and dealing with belonging and dealing with transcendence becomes a matter of devotion to the nation in the 19th century and beyond. Ernest Gellner Benedict Anderson, Anthony D. Smith, a lot of the very prominent scholars of nationalism, Carlton Hayes with his book called Nationalism, a Religion. This is a very kind of common idea. And then in the economic sphere, you can, Marx's idea of commodity fetishism, the idea that commodities now in capitalism take on life while the life is being drained away from human beings. So there are all of these kinds of manifestations of this migration of the holy into other areas that we usually call secular. And one of the uses of calling them secular means that we're then licensed to not see the way in which these things are treated as if they were divine. And so we just excuse ourselves from having to look closely.
And it also excuses the violence that we perpetrate. Like you write in your book, it became stupid and unsensible to die for your God, but it became really wise and necessary to die for your country. And that in itself says a lot. Who are you willing to kill and die for? That's where your holiness lies. And that one indeed shifted. So I think we've got some of the main important premises summarized here. So Paul, from your completely different field of academic research, what's some of the first reactions you have to what you lay
thank
down
you
here?
very much for this for this explanation. I'm immediately thinking about I'm dealing with the Asian religions, so Hinduism and Buddhism. The problems that you always get if you try to separate secularism from religion in Asian context. In Hinduism and Buddhism, it's always very complicated to separate these two. It's almost similar like separation between philosophy and religion. In Asia, it also doesn't work. This doesn't imply that they don't have philosophical ideas, things that we would call philosophy, but it works differently. I mean, if I would describe the religions of Asia, if I was given the opportunity to do this all over again, I would certainly make a separate religion of divine kingship, because it is present from the Iranian time. It was present in the Emperor Ashoka, 3rd century BC. It has got to do with Xi at present, who tries to be a Chinese emperor because he's doing everything the emperor is doing. It's like the polar star and everything is turning around him. So how it is so complicated to distinguish between these various spheres. The junta in Myanmar at present, who is doing all these horrible violent things, is doing this, and the whole action is called Anuvrata. And Anuvrata was the name of one of the ancient kings of one of the ancient capitals of Myanmar, Bagan, in the 11th century. And he was a god king. He was converted to Buddhism, and to change his reign into a kind of Buddhist paradise, he fought with his army. And the same thing, Modi is always appealing to this concept called Rama Raja, the government of Rama. Rama is the Hindu god Rama, but he is the most just king thinkable. So Vishnu came to the earth to reign as Rama and to found a kingdom that was completely, just as everything paradise-like. And this is what you get if you remove all enemies of the true religion. That's one of those ideas that's present. That's also why you would say Ram Raja, well, then you have to be friendly and behave correctly and no violence, etc. No, you have to fight against Christians and Muslims because they are not the true Hindus. They can never be, so to say, the monkeys in the army of Rama, because you have to be a peace fighter, which implies that you are one of the soldiers in Rama's army, monkeys and bears. So others have to be removed. These are the enemies. They belong to the other side, to Ravana or something. So this distinction between the secular and the religious, if it comes to Asian cultures, quite complicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and certainly in Modi's case, he's simply a nationalist. I mean, that's very much a part of what Hindu nationalism is.
Hindu nationalism
and that's what makes it interesting for me, that mostly when we look at the violence that RSS and Modi and so on are doing, then we have a tendency to attribute it to his radical Hinduism and not to his radical nationalism.
Yeah.
One of the things, if I'm a critic and I'm listening to that, a lot of people say, well, there's your proof, right? Hinduism, Buddhism have always been violent, going back to and that's more proof that religion causes violence. But of course, what you're saying is that, what do you mean religion? Why are you saying they're religions? Because there is no distinction between religious and political.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I point out in the book is that there's a lot of contemporary advocates of Hindutva, Hindu nationalism, that refuse to call Hinduism a religion because they say it's not about private beliefs. It is public, it's familial, it's social, it's political, it's all of these
cultural
things. And to call it a religion is to put it in this box that then belongs in private. And this is basically what the British found useful about this term religion, is you could take everything it meant to be Indian and call it Hinduism. And then if you call it a religion, that means it's essentially private. And so to be Indian is to be private, and to be British is to be public. And so it has these tremendous kind of ideological uses.
In the Netherlands, it is extremely important for the modern Buddhist that Buddhism is not supposed to be a religion. So if I give a lecture for a group here, always the first question, the first finger that raises, Professor, do you consider Hinduism to be a religion? And then I always start, well, that depends on what you call a religion. There's so many definitions of what is a religion and what is not, etc. But why is the question important? And then very often these kind of argumentations come forward. So because I always have the tendency to reply to this question, why is this important? What's behind your question? And it's very often, but religion is about repression, about dogmas, things are not allowed, no alcohol, and fighting. And if Buddhism people start to smile immediately. Buddhism is spirituality. It's about my growth, my personal life. Indeed, that's one of the first things. My practice. It's what I'm doing, sitting at home on my cushion, meditating, and nothing wrong with meditation. If people want to meditate, well, let them do so. 2 times 20 minutes a day. If they can survive that way and become less violent, very good. But if I tell them something about a history of Buddhist wars or something, unthinkable. Simply don't want to hear about it. And of course, you're absolutely right. When is a war a Buddhist war? That's of course always a very complicated thing. Sometimes I tell people then, well, if you're sanctified by monks, and there are Buddhist aspects to that war. And the same Anuvrata, this king from Bagan, he conquered the Mon capital to get the Pali canonical writings, the Tipitaka from King Manuha, and also the relics of the Buddha. And the relics of the Buddha even came spontaneously out of the stupas because they wanted to be in the possession of King Anuvrata. And by the way, the monks also had some harbors, but that was just mere convenience. I mean, sure, that's one of the reasons. But no, that was just convenience. The harbors also wanted to be in the possession of the king. You always come across these kind of ideas. And it even happened, there was a very popular singer in the Netherlands. He was a Buddhist. And when he was confronted with the idea about Buddhist violence, or violence, well, sanctified by Buddhism, he said, but at that moment they are not Buddhists.
Right. Right, just like the Crusaders are not really Christians, and ISIS is not really Muslims, and so on. Right, and in one sense, you want to encourage him to say that in the normative sense, but in the descriptive, empirical sense, that's just special pleading. Right?
One of the funny things for me when I went to Iran is also how the reality completely reverses what we are thinking when we think of a country like Iran from the myth of religious violence, because everybody here thinks the opposite. It is really religious, it's really oppressive, and it is an oppressive regime. But when you come into Iran, it doesn't feel very religious. I used to live in Turkey for a year, and I really love the azan, the call to prayer, which gulfs over a whole city, and so it's beautiful, and I really like it. When you come to Iran, you almost don't hear it. The loudspeakers are really, they're not very loud, and so Islam is not really in your face. You'll see a minaret here and there maybe, but what is in your face is nationalism. It's flags of Iran everywhere. And then there's also the fusion of the two with the martyrs, of course. There's lots of faces of martyrs on various buildings, but that's a good example. How would we be able to differentiate a martyr from Iran in a nationalistic or in a religious sense? So when it's not about Buddhists, when it's about Muslims, all of a sudden it's nothing but religiousness that we see, and that's how they're supposed to act because, well, Muslims are religious, so that leads to fanatical violence, which is interesting.
So you're not saying it's really nationalist and not religious.
No, not at all.
You're saying that these distinctions are
can
artificial.
also not be made in Iran, and it blinds you to the real dynamics in Iran because there's lots going on. There's religious opposition. There's also other types of political, economic opposition. It's all there, but it blinds people in the West when they look at Iran. It completely blinds them because they look at with the lens of the myth of religious violence and makes it impossible to see the nuances in a country like that and what is really driving it. And then when it comes to spirituality, then we also have the same thing in Islam. But with Sufism, that's what people do with Buddhism in general. The same thing happens with Sufism. Sufism cannot be anything but mystical and spiritual and nice because it's the mystical side of Islam. There's lots to say about that. But one of the interesting things about the history of Iran is that Ayatollah Khomeini, he used to use mystical poetry to encourage the soldiers to go and fight against the Iraqis. Even more so, he used poetry of Al-Hallaj, which is a really well-known mystic in the Sufi tradition. But nobody will look at Ayatollah Khomeini and see him as a spiritual, mystical leader. But he wrote mystical poetry himself. He used Al-Hallaj as the example to follow when they went to fight against the Iraqis. Al-Hallaj was supposedly killed by those Arabs while he had a Persian form of mysticism and Islam, and that's what the Iranians were fighting for. That was a bit of the us versus them that he was creating with a person like Al-Hallaj. But you get the same thing there. Oh, but that's not real Sufism. That's not what mysticism is about. It's the exact same thing. When I give lectures about that particular topic, it's the same thing. People can't handle that spirituality can also lead to violence, just like, well, normative or let's say traditional religions can.
Right. And that there are secular forms of, spirituality, if you will, that can lead to violence. And in that sense, Iran is a really interesting case study because in 1979, you have the Islamic Revolution, and in the United States, we all suddenly started paying attention to Iran and say, what is this? What are these crazy people doing? Now they hate us for no reason at all. They must have had some bizarre religious experience, and the Shiite, Muslim, so we shrug our shoulders and say, what is this? It's religious, right? And so that is the way then that we ignore what has been going on for the previous 26 years, where you have a secular violent regime. The United States and Great Britain overthrow a democratically elected government in 1953 and install the Shah, and he spends the next 26 years with full American support, torturing and killing people and so on, and imposing a secular dress code, among other things. But that then all gets ignored if we can say, well, the causes of the violence in modern-day Iran are religious. Then we don't have to look at the whole history of American imperialism in Iran and other parts of the Middle East. It's just that they've had some bizarre religious awakening, and that's what the cause of the problem is. So it's a prime example of this kind of myth of religious violence.
Yeah. Indeed. I was wondering, how would you incorporate this concept of spirituality in your thinking about the myth? Because your book goes really deep into nationalism as this kind of surrogate for religion, or at least the migration of the holy, as we discussed. That's the thing you fight for and die for. It's the state, and it's not religion anymore. And so religion has to be private while the state will deal with the affairs in the public. And that's a good way of organizing the world. So that's the idea. That's why the myth of religious violence exists. But what do we do with spirituality? Because this term spirituality is in between this religious and secular. It has a lot to do with not wanting to be seen as dogmatic and violent and so on. So it's there. But while nationalism also tells you what you should die for, spirituality doesn't. So I don't know if you can do something with that concept.
Well, let me give it a try. I mean, this is not something I've thought a lot about, but there's a number of ways that you can use this term spirituality. And one of the ways is to say, I'm not into institutional or public forms of whatever used to be called, faith, religion, so on, church. But I'm into spirituality, and so this is a private kind of thing and harmless. And so it kind of reinforces the privatization of what is called religion by making it even more, ethereal. Another way of using it, though, you could have an overarching term of spirituality, and you could show that what that means in a Christian context might mean something like the disciplines that a monk undergoes. But you could also talk about secular kinds of spirituality as the discipline which a soldier undertakes as a kind of spirituality, this kind of intense self-discipline and dedication to a larger cause, which is not just spiritual, but bodily at the same time. It's this kind of a technology of the soul, I suppose, is one way of using this term spirituality, which could be both, what we call religious and both what we call secular. And that's another way of kind of leveling the playing field. A lot of what I'm trying to do in the book is just level the playing field between so-called religious and so-called secular ideologies, institutions, practices, and so on, and show that people kill for all sorts of things, and that there's no, useful purpose for separating those things into religious and secular.
Yeah, I like that idea of dynamic of the soul and kind of disciplining of the soul as spirituality versus the other view on spirituality as kind of the spirituality is often used as the dichotomy of good religion versus bad religion. In a secular society, we supposedly don't have any religion, but if we have something, we've got spirituality. And basically that means the good form of religion, which again isn't violent. And that makes it difficult to see the other type of spirituality you're describing. I've got something in my notes which I brought with me. And Paul and me, we have talked about it before in our Dutch podcasts. But it's about the militarization of mindfulness, which I found really interesting, because mindfulness is the example of nothing but interior, sitting down on your cushion and feeling the peace within of the now and so on. But interestingly enough, in the US, there's a lot of militarization of mindfulness going on, and there's a professor, Amishi Jha. She has a TED Talk as well, which has been viewed for hundreds, thousands of times, if not millions. And she works with the US Army to measure neurobehavior under stress and develop ways to optimize mindfulness in battle.
Whoa.
And she actually, she wrote in the Inquiring Mind journal, "I have had an easier time speaking at the Pentagon and talking to generals than I have convincing some Buddhists that what we're doing is okay." And she writes it as if that's very surprising.
Wow.
I got this from an article where it then says, Amishi Jha believes that military mindfulness and psychology will provide soldiers and drone pilots with mental armor so soldiers can base their decisions on what is in front of them. So living in the now makes you a better soldier. But that brings us immediately to Zen ideas and the war between the Japanese and the Chinese, does it not?
Oh, sure. In the various ways, Buddhism was connected to these kinds of practices. The self-sacrifice for the country, the nationalism, the emperor, the Tenno, who was the center of the universe, and indeed getting killed for the higher cause of the country, which is the paradise, which is center of the universe, etc. Oh, my goodness. We humans are capable of such impossible things.
Of taking the nicest ideas and always subverting them into something
yeah.
violent eventually. Yeah.
Of course, you can apply mindfulness if it comes to this kind of application. You can apply it for anything. But it's always the same thing with ideas. You can do anything with it. Mm-hmm. And later on, generations later on, we'll decide whether it was good or bad or something.
What I am wondering about is, would you say it's a specific Western thing to be blind to the violence that you're doing, either by calling it benign and inevitable, or we have to bomb them into democracy, otherwise the world will be in trouble, and so on, that kind of ideas? I was wondering about it also a bit, because you talked, Paul, about those king gods, kind of. I'm not sure whether I can structurally see it in history, but I have somehow a feeling that there was a lot of cultures where there wasn't us versus them. Those are the baddies, we're the goodies. But the violence, they would be proud of the violence. It's not like they would say, we're the goodies because we don't commit any violence. They would actually say, see, and we conquered them. This actually proves that we're the good guys because we were able to conquer them. So I'm wondering a bit, is that a typical Western modern thing to be blind to that violent part?
No, I would say not, because what I know from Asia, very often you dehumanize the other ones. The others are not humans, so you can fight them. So there's a very good reason. You're not killing them. You're killing animals or something. You're not killing humans. In Sri Lanka, this King Duttagamani, somewhat 2nd, 3rd century BC, he fought against the Tamil king Elara with a relic of the Buddha on the top of his lance. And the Buddha was talking about peace, etc. But he fought with the relic of the Buddha on the top of his lance, killed the king in the end, and killed a lot of Tamils. Later on, he felt remorse. Killed so many people. And then the Buddhist monks comfort him. No, only 1.5 person was killed, because one of the Tamils had converted to Buddhism, and one was about to become a Buddhist. So that's 1.5 person were killed. The rest were not humans, because they were Tamils. So you dehumanize the other. There are also examples in the Rig Veda, for instance, where now there's a very big debate whether this indeed an invasion took place in India of Sanskrit speakers, etc. Well, I'll leave that one for a moment. But the Anasikas, the people without a nose, as they are described in Sanskrit, the Dasyus, they're not humans. They are demons, so you kill them because they are demons. They are not your own, because they are unhuman. So there's a lot of violence in there, but it is, let us say, mindful violence, rightfully directed towards evil creatures.
Exactly like the Nazi ideology.
They're not humans.
There's a sense in which there is this connection between the violence and the sacred, but it's usually misunderstood. So René Girard's famous book, Violence and the Sacred, kind of makes this connection. But a lot of people misread Girard and think that he's arguing that religion causes violence. But his argument is really rather that violence causes religion. Right, that in order to maintain social order, you have to kind of scapegoat certain groups to kind of keep a lid on mimetic desire. And so you create a kind of ritual ways of justifying that. So a lot of people just read that and say, oh, yeah, Girard agrees religion causes violence. But that's not what he's arguing. He's arguing that there is this kind of sacredness about violence, and that infects both so-called religious traditional societies and modern secular Western ones. And so he's also kind of leveling the playing field and saying that, in a sense, in order to make war or to have a judicial system, you have to find these very deep ways of justifying that give them an aura of sacredness. But it's not only Christians and Muslims that do that. It is atheists and agnostics and humanists. And so he's really kind of leveling that playing field. And that's really what I'm after in the book. Let's stop talking about religious violence or secular violence, although nobody ever talks about that. Let's just talk about violence and what makes people kill for all sorts of things. They kill for gods, but they kill for flags and oil and freedom and free markets and free elections and on, ethnicity and so on. People kill for all sorts of things. Let's see if we can get at the roots of violence and try to do away with some of these binaries. I mean, in a lot of ways, violence depends on binaries, us versus them. And this religious secular division is another one of those binaries. And so it actually can lead people to do violence, as in the Iraq War, right? We're going to, transform the Middle East into the image of the secular West. And so it becomes a way of justifying violence rather than opposing it. So let's try to do away with yet another one of these binaries that cause violence.
Yeah. I want to get into the dynamic of us versus them, religious versus secular, and should we overcome it and so on. But just one pet theory that I wanted to propose you. I've been running around with this idea. It links to much of what we have said, that you can kill and be violent for all sorts of reasons. And I've got this theory that if we look at Donald Trump, who has been talked about a whole lot, it's difficult to call him religious. I know he had his photo up where he had his Bible upside down and so on. And
he's holding it like he's never seen one before.
He probably didn't.
It's a feeling.
He has this prosperity gospel preacher that he's a good friend with, and he sometimes goes on stage with, and so on. But nobody really takes him seriously as a religious person. But I was thinking, he's made out to be just a crazy guy, certainly in Europe. In the US, you've got two sides, of course, but in Europe, he's made to seem like simply a crazy guy, narcissist, and so on. But I was thinking that, well, if you look at him ideologically, for me, he's the extremist version of positive thinking. Because if you look at his book, The Art of the Deal, it's a typical version of positive thinking, which basically, as a bottom line has, as long as you're focused with your mind on the thing that you want and you really, really want it, it will come to you. And you have to think positively about it, and all negative thoughts are bad. If you look at Trump in that manner, he's completely comprehensible. That's the extremist version of thinking like that. His own reality is nothing but, in my reality, everything is fine, I'm the big guy, and whatever I want, I'll get it. And everything else is negative thinking. I'm not gonna go there. And so his violence and racism and so on, in my view, is the extremist version of positive thinking, but nobody will ever see it that way. So that's my pet theory. What do you think as an American of my proposal?
Oh, Jonas, I think that's really interesting, and that's really true. Norman Vincent Peale is the guy that you're thinking of. He's long dead, but Trump apparently attended Norman Vincent Peale's church in New York City many decades ago. He attended a few times and absorbed some of this kind of power of positive thinking stuff. But I think that's right. I mean, I sometimes think that to call Donald Trump a liar is to give him too much credit for being able to tell the distinction between the truth and lies. I'm not sure he really knows the difference between what's true and what he wants. Right? I mean, it just seems like his basic driving impulse, what gets him out of bed is the morning, is just this basic driving impulse that can be reduced to the word gimme. I want that. And I'm not sure he really, at some level, knows the difference between what he wants and what's actually true, or what he wants to be true and what actually is true. It's just this. So in some sense, to become a liar would be an achievement for Trump.
Definitely. Okay, back to the opposition, religious, secular. When all is said and done, and everything can lead to violence, so there is no distinction between religious violence and secular violence, or positive thinking violence, or democratic violence, and so on, why do we still have the distinction? Because I remember seeing a talk of you on YouTube where you said something in the lines of, Yeah, well, it's all difficult, but we all know there is a difference between religious and secular, and then you simply go on and you deconstruct the myth of religious violence. But I had the feeling, why do we still maintain the difference? Why not just throw it in the dustbin and just say we're all talking about religious ideas all the time, whether they're Marxist or not? Wouldn't that make it more easy also to deal with them and to grapple with them in a theological manner more than what we try to do now, a rational, supposedly objective, sociological manner or something? Just call them for what they are. Theology, maybe without God, but there's many religions who don't have necessarily the same type of divinity as Christianity, so that's not a problem. You can be a religion and still have atheist tendency. So why still maintain secular religious? Or by now have you thrown it into the dustbin?
It doesn't sound like something I would say to defend that distinction. I may have been speaking in someone else's voice, because I know that sometimes I'll start a lecture by saying, oh, everybody knows there's a difference between religious and secular.
It's been 5 or 10 years even that I've seen it, so maybe I remember it.
It might have been in somebody else's voice, but because I have had a little bit of an evolution on this question. Because what I used to say was, I try to not use the word religious and secular because it just causes too much confusion. There's too much confusion around these ideas. But I've come to see that we can't just do that. You can't just throw out those terms, not only because they are prevalent and used, but there are the first time I began to think different about this is when a professor in the religious studies department at the University of Virginia said, we can't just throw out the term religion or I'll be out of a job, right? If there's no such thing as religion, then there's no such thing as religious studies, and so on. And I thought, here you've got an example where the term religion is doing some positive work. It is allowing for theology to be done at Thomas Jefferson's University, in which you're not supposed to have theology, right? And so, strategically there, let's hold on to that. But the other time I was at the University of California at Berkeley in the political science department, and one of the students asked me this question, and I said, I try not to talk about it. And then later at dinner, one of the graduate students said, look, we have tried for years to get this very secular university and a very secular department to take religion seriously, and they finally have, and now you're pulling out the rug from under us, And so it became clear that you can't just not talk about it, that it has certain purposes. But it became clear to me that you have to talk about religion and the secular not as if it were a thing out there, a phenomenon out there in the world that we just for some reason have a great deal of difficulty describing, and we can't come up with a definition of it. We all know it's out there. We just for some reason can't agree on a definition, and it's very hard to define, and that sort of thing. We need to stop thinking of it as this thing out there, and we need to think about it as a lens. So it's not this water bottle on the table. It's my glasses that I'm wearing that you can't see because this is a podcast. But it's a lens. The religious-secular distinction is a lens through which we view the world, and it's not a thing out there in the world. And if we think of it that way, then we're constantly having a discourse about what sort of work is this distinction doing in any particular context. Is it doing something positive? Is it doing something neutral? Is it a way of just distinguishing what I do in church from what I do in my garden? Fine. Or is it doing something ideologically negative, which it oftentimes is doing, which is why I tend to avoid using that language. So in some ways, what a religious studies department ought to do, one of the things it ought to do anyway, is investigate this distinction between the religious and the secular, and make sure that we know what we're up against in any given context in which that distinction is being used.
Well, in your field, that distinction, and how do you see the balance? Does it more good or does it do more harm?
Yeah, I
that
definitely
lens?
agree. It depends on what you do with it and how you look at things. And indeed, the metaphor of the lens is very important, very meaningful. What you say, because it's got to say something about how you, as an individual, are watching, looking at these phenomena in the world. But it's definitely true. If Buddhism would not be a religion, I would lose half of my job. So I only teach Hinduism, so not too fond of that, of course. But it is these the connotations that these terms seem to evoke, religion and secular. So immediately with the word religion, there's an enormous series of concepts that comes up. Violence, things not allowed. You have to believe things. And spirituality, at least if I look at the Netherlands, spirituality and secular, they are very often combined together, but not with religion. No. That there could be a spiritual aim of what the junta in Myanmar is doing. I mean, they have some kind of idea about how an ideal state should emerge out of a kind of divine kingship with the Buddha coming down and ruling, etc. It's unthinkable here, at least not in the common discourse. Unthinkable. Whereas in Asia, these ideas do play a part. So I'm very glad with your posing this, that secular religious as an opposition, it doesn't work. But we have to work with the concept that we are using. So we can't simply deny these because the words are being used by people.
Yeah.
And we can simply say they lose value. Yeah, but they don't have any value. Not from the academic perspective, maybe, but not outside, not in the world, because they are being used, and they're being used by many scholars as well. And we have to talk in the language that we are using. So even though these concepts may be very awkward and simply not always working.
Yeah. A bit of a more personal question then. But you're a Catholic yourself. You're very involved in the church. Part of your research, not for this book, but for other books, is about church and sacrament and so on. And so my question is a bit, one thing is, of course, that every ideology or every religion or every worldview can become violent. So there's no sense in picking one because it would be less violent or more peaceful. But the other thing is feeling part of an institution. And so how do you square your membership of the church with violence? Because if there has been an institution in the world for the last 2,000 years, which has done a lot of violence as an institution, because you could say, when we're looking at the idea of violence, many institutions again have done violence, but to overcome violence itself, then it's really necessary, in my view, to think about hierarchy and power and so on. And I'm not sure that the hierarchical structure of the church is the best way forward, but I've got a bit of an anarchist soul in me. So I'm wondering how you view your membership to the church in relation to its violent history and so on, and how you go past it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an anarchist at heart too, but a Catholic anarchist, right? Okay. Dorothy Day is one of my heroes in that respect, a Catholic anarchist. But anarchy doesn't necessarily mean no order. It just means perhaps no coercive order.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean the political sense of anarchy, of course, yeah. Right,
and so there are forms of hierarchy, I think, that can be nonviolent. There are hierarchies of truths. There are hierarchies of practices. There are, even in the most peaceful of traditions, there are masters of the craft that one needs to learn from. Most of our bishops are not that way, but that's not necessarily the case. Some of them are. You've got Oscar Romero, who is a master of the craft of following Christ and dying, and that is a type of hierarchy, right? So making the church a democracy, I don't think necessarily solves the problem, because democracies can be violent too for other reasons. So it's complicated, as in all of life. I mean, one thing that I want to push back on a little bit is this idea that, no other institution has been as violent as the Catholic Church throughout history. The Spanish Inquisition, over the course of 350 years, the estimates are that between 3,000 and 5,000 people were killed for heresy, which is about the number of people the Khmer Rouge killed every 3 days. And so the idea that the Spanish Inquisition looms large, is just, again, part of this black legend that just doesn't really reflect the historical reality. So I do want to kind of push back on that a little bit. The Crusades, Carlton Hayes pointed out that all the little crosses from World War I in France, saying died for the fatherland. He said those numbers in 4 years of war dwarf the numbers from 4 centuries of crusades. So I do want to push back on that. But I don't want to be in the position of defending, the church as if to say, oh, no, we're not really violent, we're really peaceful. We're both, It's an institution that has nurtured the message of Jesus Christ, which I think is essentially nonviolent through the centuries. And it has also justified violence in many different ways. There are hopeful signs in the last century, really, that the church, once it loses power, once Christendom dies in the 20th century, the church becomes more and more interested in nonviolence, and figures like Dorothy Day become more of the norm than the exception. And Thomas Merton and Pope Francis, both Pope Francis and Cardinal Ratzinger, before he was Pope, said, can we even talk about a just war anymore? Is there even such a thing? And so there's this whole movement, to the horror of many right-wing Catholics, there's this whole movement towards nonviolence in the tradition of the church. So it's always a mixed bag. It's always a little bit of following Jesus and a little bit of something else going on.
Yeah, I'll get to the nonviolent Jesus in a bit. But first, Paul, you don't belong to a tradition.
No,
you don't see it that way, but you often say, I've converted to the Asian cultures.
The Asian cultures, for sure.
Yeah. But not seeing yourself as a religious person, does it have anything to do with the question of violence or not? Is that not in the picture?
Oh, no, not really. No,
on a personal level?
No, that's just a personal level.
But then even if you say, I converted to the Asian cultures, well, the culture itself is also full of violence.
And I'm living with these stories, Ramayana, Mahabharata, and they're full of violent stories. Yeah. But that's part of a self-image in Hinduism, for instance, fighting for peace. That's always the same thing. And then they start fighting and describe everything very violently and all the blood gushing to the streets, etc. Yeah, that's people are fascinated by it, and you read it and you translate it. Oh, now it gets interesting once more, because you have to get through all these passages of killing, etc. Yeah, true. Yeah, and it's indeed true. I come to Kathmandu very often in Nepal, and there you can see the most beautiful ideas about non-violence. And when it is Dashera, they kill so many goats and buffaloes, and the blood running through the streets, etc. It does happen, especially for the goddesses. The goddesses need blood once a year. So whole year long they give their jewelry, that's the fruit of the fields, etc. They give these to us. So one day they want it all back. That's the day of the horrible sacrifices and the blood sacrifices, and that does happen. But I'm fascinated, being converted not to Hinduism or Buddhism, but to the Asian cultures, about these big contrasts. How can they be united? How can they be together? And this is one of the things that fascinates me. How can the same humans practice vegetarianism all the year long, and then all of a sudden kill all these buffaloes and goats, etc. That's one of the fascinating things, I think, the big opposition that we still keep in our minds, apparently, as humans, or in one human even. How can this be? Mm-hmm. How is it possible that we do this, and that we still consider ourselves to be decent beings, etc.? How can this be? And that is one of the fascinating things, yes, and I come across this very often in Asia, for sure. How can you talk about that everybody is having an immortal Atman, and that we are all humans, etc., and yet stick to the caste system? Because it's very strong and getting stronger even, I get the impression. How can this be? Whereas we're all the same, we share the same divine inner world, you would say. These kind of things, these fascinate me, and these questions never leave me. So, indeed, this is taking part of the culture, and if this is religious or spiritual or whatever, well, it's what I'm doing, what I'm thinking about.
It is fascinating, and it's indeed what we've been talking about. We all have the desire for peace, and yet violence is a daily thing. Certainly now with wars in Ukraine and in Yemen still, and so on and so on. But so, you've mentioned before, and I completely agree, we have to get out of this as if it helps us to call some violence religious, as if that helps us to deal with it. It doesn't. It just makes a category, and it's useless when it comes to dealing with violence itself. Then we'll have to confront the dynamic of violence. Part of it is the us versus them, and we have to overcome it. So I think that's a bit the last few things that I wanted to discuss. How do you think of overcoming violence? I mean, there's lots of other literature about it, but you, from a spiritual standpoint, if you say in the long run, or if you look at Jesus and how his message has been transferred through tradition, eventually I see him as a person of nonviolence. Is that how he inspires you? And then what are some ideas, some inspiration that we can all take along to overcome the dynamic of violence? If we leave the myth behind but just confront ourselves with violence, how do we overcome it?
Yeah, that's a good question, and not one to which I have a very complete answer at all. I'm trying to deal with one fairly limited question about violence, about this question of, religion and violence. But the question of what causes violence in general, and how do you deal with it, and even how you define it, I mean, I tend to talk about violence in terms of harm against bodies, right? But there are other much more expansive definitions of violence that include mental harm and the exclusion, of women, other kinds of exclusions. And all of those, I think, do have a claim to be considered violence in a much broader sense. But I just don't have the capabilities of dealing with those broader questions. And sometimes the definition of violence gets so broadly put that it becomes kind of useless. A student, when we were in Tilburg, posed the question and cited a figure who defines violence as any kind of change in the world. And my response was, well, once you've defined violence that broadly, then I'm not sure how useful it is anymore. So from a theological point of view, I'll kind of try to narrow the question down a little bit. I am influenced by René Girard's work on this, and he's coming at it from a kind of lapsed Catholic who has come back to practice of his Catholicism. But he thinks that what is most important about the figure of Jesus Christ is that it's the identification of the divine with the victim, right? And so instead of scapegoating the victims and saying, now that we have gotten rid of the Jews or whoever, now we're good, whoever the scapegoat happens to be, because it's the scapegoat's fault, that what's important about the figure of Jesus is that it's the identification of God with the victim instead of with the victimizers. And that seems to me, it's not just championing of the victim, it's the actual identification of God with the victim. To me, that is a really powerful way of understanding Christianity, and it's a very powerful way of dealing with violence.
I sometimes have the hope that the day we can deal with violence, not being violent creatures anymore, we are no longer Homo sapiens sapiens. We have evolutionized into something else or something. Because I'm afraid that... I like your metaphor very much of God as the victim as the God. But for the time being, I've got the idea that violence is part of us. It's inside of us. And how we deal with it, with this violence, makes us humans or not. Something like this. How we develop tools to deal with our violence, because this tendency is there. You see it among small children already. But what do we do it once we grow up? No, don't do this anymore. You want to be a decent person, so you don't do these kind of things. Yeah, and the moment these ideas are no longer there, they simply don't pop up anymore. Maybe that's enlightenment or some kind of profound wisdom, or if everybody is passing through this, maybe we have changed into something else, Homo sapiens, whatever, sapientissimus, I don't know. I have this kind of hope at times, but for the time being, trying to be a decent human, and always keep on discussing what decency exactly is. What does it imply? Because it's not the same. It's not universal. It differs from Iran, from here. It's not the same. But always keep on investigating what does it imply in this situation to be a decent human. What kind of person you want to be in this context. And that's a never-ending discussion. And I'm very fond of never-ending discussions. Never-ending discussions with yourself as well.
Yeah, it's interesting what you say. It brings us completely back to the myth of religious violence, because for me, one of the things that certainly will have to happen if we want to look for our decency is to stop being blind to the violence that's within us. And that brings me back to the myth of religious violence, in the sense that part of it is really blinding ourselves for all the violence that we're doing, or making it something benign seemingly or whatever, and saying that the others, which aren't human really, that those are the violent demons or something. So I think that's why I think your book is important, to make that flip, and to see that we have the tendency to violence all within ourselves, and we will never overcome that violence unless we also deal with the simple raw fact of being Homo sapiens, which is, sadly enough, has been for the last so many thousands of years, has been a violent creature, and that's something to deal with, which is uneasy, uneasy to do.
And for some reason or other, we seem to need the bad other to be a good person ourselves. I mean, I'm from the south of the country, very small village. If there was football playing between two of these villages, Zomeren and Asten, for instance, already the war started. Just boys playing football together. I mean, first had to chase out the cows from the meadow, and then they could start playing football. But then already the war started, because they were wrong. That was one thing was for sure. Those from the other village were wrong, and we needed. I did not play football, by the way, but the others were needed, because the football boys from our village needed to be the right ones. So other ones must be wrong, whereas they were doing the same things. So apparently this is part of our creature or being or mindset or something, that we need another group that we can call wrong to be good ourselves, to distinguish between the two or something. I'm not sure, but apparently we need an enemy or something.
Yeah, I think that's right. And so if that's the case, then the basic way of dealing with violence ought to be that the critique of violence has to be self-critique.
Yes.
It always needs to start and end with self-critique.
It's also the only thing you can do to break the circle of violence. Start with yourself. You can't force the other one to stop the circle of violence, so you need to to it yourself. I'm a big Mahatma Gandhi fan, and in that sense, one of the sayings that I like most that he said is, somebody asked him, why don't you become a Christian? And his reply was, well, I like your Christianity, I like your Christ, it's just your Christians, they are so unlike your Christ. I love that still. Calls for self-reflection. Well, gentlemen, this has been a very interesting conversation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Jonas.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks, Paul. This has been really fun.
William. Yeah.